Having navigated Descartes' anxieties and the quest for a middle path, we now arrive at a perspective that fundamentally challenges the very ground upon which traditional cognition is built. We're diving into inaction, cognition as embodied action. Alright, let's start by looking at the bedrock assumption of many cognitive theories, the representationalist view. Thinkers like the cognitivists, proponents of emergence, or even folks in the Society of Mind Camp, they all tend to operate under one key idea. The world is like a well-organized puzzle. You can break it down into distinct pieces, elements, tasks, properties. Cognition, then, is simply about figuring out how to solve these puzzles, respecting the rules of the game defined by these pre-existing bits. This works brilliantly when the puzzle is clearly defined. Take chess. It's almost crystalline. You've got the board, the pieces, the rules, the turns. Everything fits neatly. No wonder computer chess is so sophisticated. We can map out the state space pretty well. But what happens when the puzzle isn't so neat? What if the boundaries are fuzzy, the pieces keep changing, and the rules aren't written down anywhere? Let's consider a robot trying to drive through a city. Can we easily define its space? Sure, we can point out discrete things, wheels, windows, red traffic lights, other cars. But unlike chess, movement here doesn't feel like moving from square A to square B. Where does the driving space end? Does the robot need to worry about pedestrians? Absolutely. Weather conditions? Crucial. Local driving customs, you bet. The list could go on forever. The world of driving isn't a neat box. It's a messy, ever-expanding landscape of details blending into a background that's constantly shifting. Success here, like successful driving for us humans, relies heavily on learned motor skills, and crucially on using common sense, that intuitive know-how about the background context. This brings us to the heart of the matter, common sense. Trying to capture this elusive thing as explicit knowledge, like knowing that wet roads are slippery, is incredibly difficult, maybe even impossible. It's more like a disposition, a practical skill honed through countless experiences. Think about learning to ride a bike or parallel park. You don't have a rule book for every contingency. Recent research on skill acquisition backs this up. And it gets even trickier when we look at the world broadly. What counts as an object depends on what you're doing. Is that patch of color an object? Maybe not. Is it part of a wall? Perhaps. Is it a sign? Possibly. The individuation of objects, properties, events seems tied to the specific task or action involved. As Winograd and Flores pointed out, the world isn't a fixed set of things waiting to be categorized. It's shaped by our interactions. These kinds of problems weren't entirely new. Back in the 70s, after 2 decades of progress, many AI researchers hit a wall. They realized even simple thought required an almost infinite amount of background knowledge, things we take for granted, like knowing a door is usually horizontal, or that people generally walk upright. This stuff is invisible because it's so obvious. The early dream of a single general problem-solving mechanism had to give way. Instead, people started building programs for specific domains, manually coding in all the necessary background info. Fast forward to today and similar strategies persist. Whether it's regularization theory constraining possible solutions based on assumed world properties or modern deep learning models learning by mimicking examples backpropagation, the common theme is striking. Both camps try to push the messy ambiguity of common sense aside, hoping to tackle it later. It feels like putting the cart before the horse. So, if our lived experience, our world as we live it, doesn't have these neat predefined edges, does it make sense to try and capture common sense as a static representation of some pre-existing reality? The argument here is a resounding no. It suggests we need to flip the script completely. Instead of seeing contextual know-how as something messy and inefficient that we need to clean up with better rules, we should see it as the very essence of creative cognition. Where does this radical idea come from? Primarily from European philosophy, particularly the hermeneutic tradition, thinkers like Heidegger and Gadamer. Hermeneutics originally meant interpreting texts, but it evolved to mean interpretation itself, the act of bringing forth meaning from a background of understanding. It's about how we actively construct meaning within our world. Now, this perspective clashes with the dominant current in Anglo-American philosophy, often called analytic philosophy. These thinkers often view folk psychology, our everyday common-sense understanding, as just a bunch of implicit assumptions that need to be scientifically reduced or replaced by a more rigorous theory. Mark Johnson highlights this tension. Continental philosophy, especially since Heidegger and Gadamer, has long recognized that understanding is deeply tied to our bodies, language, and social history, our embodiment. But analytic philosophy often resists this, clinging to the idea of meaning as a fixed link between words and an objective world, mistakenly believing that only by transcending our embodied, cultural, imaginative perspectives can we achieve true objectivity. The counter-intuition here is powerful. Perhaps knowledge isn't about mirroring an external world, but emerges from our capacity for interpretation, rooted in our biological makeup, yet lived out within a shared cultural and historical context. This allows us to make sense of our world, to have a world. Johnson elaborates, meaning isn't just abstract symbols, it includes models of our embodied experience, our preconceptual ways of perceiving, orienting ourselves, interacting with things. These aren't private, locked away in our heads. Our communities help us interpret and codify these shared models. They become cultural modalities of experience, shaping how we understand our world coherently. The big challenge, then, is bridging this rich philosophical insight with the hard science of cognition, neuroscience, linguistics, psychology. The sciences, in turn, challenge the deepest assumptions of our scientific legacy, the idea that the world is independent of the knower. If cognition is inseparable from common sense, and common sense is our embodied and social history, what follows? The conclusion is unavoidable. The relationship between the mind and the world isn't one of simple reflection or projection. Instead, knower and known, mind and world, specify each other mutually. They co-originate. If this critique holds water, then real progress in understanding cognition requires abandoning the starting point of a pre-given world out there that we merely recover internally via representations. In recent years, some cognitive scientists have taken this philosophical critique and moved it into the lab, applying it directly to AI research. They're proposing concrete alternatives that stray further from traditional cognitivism than even the emergentist projects, while still drawing on insights and methods developed in those contexts. Let's look at one such approach. We touched on this earlier, the shift away from thinking of the mind as a simple input-output machine processing information, towards seeing it as an emergent, autonomous network. Remember the distinction? Heteronomous systems are controlled externally, input-output, treating the world as independent. Autonomous systems, however, are defined by their internal self-organization, operational closure, and see the world as dependent and enacted. Cellular automata, those simple grids of cells following rules, are a good example of emergent properties arising from network architecture. But they were initially treated as isolated entities. What if we add structural coupling? Imagine throwing a ring of these cellular automata, let's call it Vittorio, into a random environment, a soup of zeros and ones, like a cell entering a chemical bath. When a cell in Vittorio bumps into a 0 or 1, its state changes to match that disturbance. See Figure 8.1. Now, Vittorio's behavior isn't random. It depends entirely on its internal rule, its dynamic. If the rule leads to simple dynamics like settling down quickly or just chaotic noise, then disturbances from the soup are basically ignored. The system just shrugs them off. But if the rule belongs to certain classes, specifically class 2 or 3, which exhibit complex, stable patterns, then things get interesting. A single disturbance can cause Vittorio to shift from one stable pattern to another, distinct stable pattern. Look at Figure 8.2.2. The arrow shows a disturbance hitting a cell, and the subsequent dynamics show the system compensating, settling into a new configuration. Only these intermediate complexity rules allow for meaningful consequences given this type of interaction. Let's zoom in on one specific rule, Rule 101,000, shown in Figure 8.33. Here's the cool part. A single disturbance flips the spatial pattern. But hit the same cell again with another disturbance, and poof, it goes back to the original pattern. So any odd number of disturbances in the same place causes a change, while any even number results in no net change. The disturbance is effectively cancelled out. This specific Vittorio, through its internal rule and how it interacts with the soup, has selected or enacted a very particular significance. It's become a recognizer of odd sequences of disturbances. It didn't get programmed to do this. Its autonomy combined with its coupling to the environment made this distinction emerge as relevant. What does this mean? The distinctions Vittorio selects, like odd sequence, represent the regularities with which it co-varies with its environment. These regularities constitute Vittorio's world. Notice, this world wasn't designed or preloaded. It emerged through the history of Vittorio's interactions with the soup. It's enacted. Vittorio gives us a minimal, almost trivial, example of how autonomy and structural coupling are enough to bring forth a world of relevance. Now, don't underestimate the simplicity. The point is to trace the process clearly. If such basic significance can emerge here, imagine the incredibly rich and complex significances enacted by living cells, brains, immune systems, all of which share the properties of being autonomous and structurally coupled, albeit in vastly more complex ways. This contrast with digital computers is stark. A computer is the classic example of a heteronomous system. Its meaning is entirely dictated by the programmer who defines the input-output relationships. Type A plus B equals C. If you follow the instructions, you get the expected result. Living systems are fundamentally different. While we can sometimes describe parts of their behavior input-output style under highly controlled conditions, generally, the meaning of an interaction for a living system isn't imposed from the outside. It arises from the system's own organization and its history of engagement with the world. The significance isn't pre-programmed, it emerges from the dynamics. To really dig into this, let's use color perception as our case study. Why color? Two main reasons. First, studying color perception is like a microcosm of the entire field of cognitive science. Neuroscientists, psychologists, AI researchers, linguists, philosophers. Everyone has contributed important pieces to the puzzle. Second, color is immediately significant to our experience. We all know what it means to see red or blue. We'll explore this in 3 stages. First, the structure of chromatic appearance itself. What makes up colors and how they vary. Second, color as a perceived attribute of things in the world. Third, color as an experiential category, how we name and categorize colors. Keep in mind, in actual experience, these layers blend together, but we'll separate them here for clarity. So, what's the structure of color appearance? 2 key things. First, all the colors we see can be described using combinations of just 6 basic colors: red, green, yellow, blue, black, and white. Think orange is red plus yellow. Turquoise is blue plus green, simple enough. Second, color appearance varies along 3 dimensions. Chroma refers to the intensity or purity of a basic color. Think pure red versus a pale red. Complex chromas arise from mixing like reddish yellow. Importantly, there are opposing chromas. Red and green can't mix to form a single binary chroma, nor can yellow and blue. Then there's saturation, how strong or vivid the color is, ranging from desaturated near gray to saturated. Finally, brightness or lightness, from dazzlingly bright to barely visible. Colors with 0 chroma are achromatic, black, white, and grays. Why this specific structure? Why the oppositions? Enter the opponent process theory, developed from Herring's work and formalized by Hurwicz and Jameson. The core idea is that our visual system uses 3 channels to process color. One channel handles brightness differences, achromatic. The other 2 handle chromatic differences. Physiologically, this likely involves complex interactions between retinal cells and neurons further along the pathway. We have 3 types of cones in our retina, sensitive to long L, medium M, and short S wavelengths of light. Through processes of excitation and inhibition, the brain combines and subtracts these signals. Adding L, M, and S signals gives us the brightness channel. Subtracting M from L gives the red-green channel. Subtracting S from the sum of L and M gives the yellow-blue channel. Crucially, these channels are antagonistic. If you increase the signal for red, the green signal must decrease, and vice versa. Same for yellow and blue. This explains why we never perceive a direct mix of red-green or yellow-blue, and why some colors are simple one channel active, others binary both channels active. Okay, so we understand the structure of color appearance. Now, let's consider color as a perceived attribute of things in the world. A naive thought might be, the color I see corresponds to the light reflected by that object. If something looks green, it must reflect mostly medium wavelength light. But reality throws curveballs. If you measure the light reflected by the world around you, you find no simple one-to-one match between the light hitting your eye and the color you perceive, especially when things are in complex scenes. Colors show remarkable constancy. An apple looks red whether it's under indoor lighting or bright sunlight. Yet, 2 patches of paper reflecting exactly the same light can look different if placed next to each other due to simultaneous contrast. This tells us we can't just explain color perception by looking at local light reflection. Something more complex is going on, involving comparisons across the visual scene, handled by neural processes we only partially understand. What's happening neurologically? At the retinal level, yes, the 3 cone types feed into those opponent channels. But the retinas themselves aren't uniform. Local activity depends on the whole retinal image, creating relative values. The magic happens across multiple levels of the visual pathways: thalamus, primary visual cortex V1, extrastriate areas like V2, V3, and crucially V4. Neurons in V4 in particular seem directly linked to color constancy effects. These structures form a distributed subnetwork, almost like a specialized agent dedicated to color perception. And importantly, color doesn't exist in isolation. It's constantly interacting with other visual features: shape, texture, motion, depth, and even other senses like hearing or balance. It's all part of a cooperative, integrated perceptual experience. Consider the case of Mr. I, a famous artist who lost his color vision after a car accident. He went from creating vibrant, abstract paintings to living in a world described as like watching a black and white television. His descriptions are haunting. Everything felt unpleasant, dirty. Whites were harsh but vague, blacks cavernous. Everything seemed deformed and unnatural. This loss affected his appetite, his ability to connect intimately, even his musical taste, as he could no longer experience tones as colors synesthesia. He became nocturnal, preferring the different world of night. Eventually, he seemed to forget his former colorful world entirely, wondering if color even existed anymore. This case powerfully illustrates how our perceived world, including its colors, is constructed through complex sensorimotor processes. When these processes are disrupted, our entire experience, behavior, and conception of the world can transform dramatically. Now, someone might object, okay, all this neural complexity is fascinating, but surely the function of color vision is simply to recover the stable surface reflectance of objects, regardless of lighting changes. Think about it. Bricks reflect certain wavelengths, grass reflects others. That reflectance is constant. So, isn't color just our way of representing that underlying physical property? The text presents several counter-arguments. First, the structure of color doesn't match the structure of reflectance. Colors have specific dimensions, oppositions, binarities, singular, binary, opposed pairs that we don't find in the physical properties of surfaces or light spectra. Reflectance varies across wavelengths, but it's not classified in these psychological ways. The properties that define color as we experience it don't have direct physical counterparts outside of our experience. Second, color isn't just on surfaces. We perceive color in volumes like the sky, in afterimages, in dreams, in memories, even in synesthetic experiences. The common thread isn't a physical property, it's color as a form of experience, constituted by neural activity. Third, the whole idea of recovering reflectance comes more from computational vision models, trying to solve the problem of illumination invariance, rather than from studying the biological or ecological purpose of natural color vision. Real-world color vision deals with both changing factors like light and weather, and constant factors like surface reflectance. Fourth, and perhaps most profoundly, the objective view assumes a pre-given world of reflectances out there. But how do we even define a surface objectively? Its borders, texture, orientation, these distinctions often rely on a perceiver. Computational models often simplify by assuming a set of known objects. But in reality, the visual system constantly segments the scene into surfaces and objects through a complex cooperative process involving all visual streams. As Guras and Zener put it, it is impossible to separate the apprehended object from its color, because color contrast forms the object. Color and object perception are intertwined, both depending on our embodied perceptual capacities. So far, we've focused on color perception, but our experience of color is also cognitive. We organize the infinite variations of hue, saturation, and brightness into a limited set of named categories. Think about the sheer number of color names in English: red, yellow, orange, green, blue, purple, violet, indigo, turquoise, magenta, and so on. This variety might suggest color categories are arbitrary, culturally imposed labels. This was the common view. But then came Brent Berlin and Paul Kay's groundbreaking 1969 study. They looked at over 90 languages and identified criteria for basic color terms, terms that aren't just synonyms for other color terms. They found that all languages have basic terms for black and white. Languages with more terms also include red, green, blue, yellow, and so on, up to a maximum of 11 basic categories. More importantly, they found that speakers of different languages agreed remarkably well on the best examples, or focal colors, for each category. For instance, the focal color for blue is almost always the same shade across languages. This led them to conclude that these basic color categories are pan-human perceptual universals, reflecting fundamental structures in human perception and cognition, not just cultural arbitrariness. How does this relate to cognition beyond just naming? Eleanor Roche studied the Dani people of New Guinea, whose language has only two basic color terms, roughly meaning warm white and cool black. Despite lacking specific words for red, green, blue, etc., Roche found fascinating results. First, even Dani speakers found the universal focal colors like red, green, blue more perceptually salient, easier to remember, and learned faster than colors at the periphery of those categories. Second, when tested on memory, the structure of their chromatic memory space was surprisingly similar to English speakers, despite vastly different linguistic categories. Third, when taught new color categories, the Dani readily learned ones structured in a natural, universal way, but struggled immensely with categories structured unnaturally, like putting the central greenish-blue color at the edge. This strongly suggests that both how we name colors and how we cognitively process them are linked to deeper, likely physiological, factors shared by our species, pointing again towards a universal basis. So, how do we get these derived categories like orange, purple, brown, pink? The basic ones, red, green, blue, yellow, black, white, seem directly tied to those opponent process neural responses. But what about the rest? Paul Kay and Chad McDaniel proposed a model using fuzzy set theory. Think of it like this. The basic neural responses define the core categories red, green, blue, yellow, black, white. Derived categories are then generated by intersecting these basic sets. Orange is the intersection of the red and yellow sets. Purple is the intersection of red and blue. Pink is the intersection of white and red. Brown is the intersection of black and yellow. This operation of intersecting fuzzy sets seems to be a universal cognitive process used by our species to generate these additional color categories from the basic perceptual ones. However, it's not just biology. Culture plays a role too. George Lakoff pointed out that categorization isn't purely innate. Studies by Kay and Kempton showed that lexical color categories can influence subjective similarity judgments. For example, English distinguishes green and blue, while Tarahumara has one word for both. Speakers of these languages tend to judge colors near the green-blue boundary differently. Similarly, McLaury found variations in how brown or purple are categorized across cultures, and even discovered unique categories like yellow with green in some Pacific Northwest Native American languages. So, color categorization is a complex interplay of universal perceptual cognitive processes and culturally specific factors. These categories are neither purely innate nor purely learned. They are experiential, consensual, and embodied, arising from our shared biological and cultural history. This brings us back to that fundamental question. What came first, the world or the image? The traditional view, let's call it the chicken position, assumes an external world with fixed laws that precedes our perception, and our task is to recover it. The radical alternative, the egg position, claims the cognitive system creates its own world. Our exploration of color suggests a middle way. Colors aren't out there independent of our perception and cognition, nor are they purely in here independent of our biology and culture. Categories like red, green, blue, and so on are experiential, consensual, and embodied. They belong to our shared biological and cultural world. The conclusion is that the chicken and the egg, the world and the perceiver, define each other mutually. They co-originate. This mutual specification pushes us beyond the traditional logic of internal versus external, based solely on representation. If we can't fully understand cognition by just recovering an external world or projecting an internal one, what's the alternative? The proposal is to study cognition not as recovery or projection, but as embodied action. What does embodied mean here? It emphasizes two crucial points. First, cognition fundamentally depends on experiences arising from having a body with diverse sensory and motor capabilities. We perceive through eyes, ears, skin, we act through limbs, voice. Second, these sensory-motor capabilities aren't isolated. They are embedded within a broader biological, psychological, and cultural context. Our actions and perceptions are shaped by our evolutionary history, our individual psychology, and our shared culture. So, wrapping up this section, the traditional representationalist views struggle to account for the richness of common sense, the fluidity of Ildefnasks, and the active, constructed nature of perception as we saw with color. The inaction framework offers a different path. It posits that cognition is fundamentally embodied action, enacted through the dynamic interplay between autonomous systems and their structural coupling with the environment. The implication is profound. The world we experience isn't a static picture recovered from the outside. It's actively co-created through our ongoing sensorimotor engagement and history. This sets the stage for exploring cognition further through this lens.